Okay, so we've talked about the overview of the DITA OT and as well as the architecture of the DITA OT. Now we're going to get right down to practical applications. We're going to talk about how do we use this thing. How do we render output in the DITA OT? So conveniently, the DITA OT comes with some scripts pre-installed that allow you to render output out of the box. So we're going to talk about two on this slide here. The first one is called build Demo.xml, and it's located in the root of the DITA OT directory. And this is a great file to use to quickly test installation of your toolkit. So if you look here, okay, so DITA OT 151 in this case, and you can see here there's a build demo file. So as always, we're going to open up the toolkit by using start command.bat, also in the root of the DITA OT. What that does for you is it sets environment variables that the DITA OT needs to know where things are on your machine. So it's always recommended when you're going to run the toolkit to start by double-clicking on this file, start command.bat. Then, as I wrote in the slide here, it's as simple as you open the command window, and then you type in ant, which refers to the ant language as we've discussed. -f is the saying that we're calling a file, and then the name of the file, in this case, build Demo.xml. And what's nice about this file is that it gives you lots of prompts for input, so you don't really have to type any input in if you go with the defaults. Okay, so here we go, ant-f build Demo.xml, enter. Okay, and it gives you all these interactive prompts. Please enter the file name. If you don't want to choose something, press enter, and it will give you hierarchy.ditamap, which is a sample DITA file that comes with the toolkit. Now, output directory also, you can do the default. I can pick web, which is like a fancy form of XHTML. And continue, yes, enter. All I did was I pressed enter a number of times. And here we go, it's running the toolkit without my having to have written any kind of project build file. Okay, so that's the easiest way to do it. Another option, which is more useful as you get more advanced, is to use the sample and build scripts that are located in DITA OT samples and sample. So what's nice about these build scripts, if you take a look for a second, is that DITA OT samples and samples, you see there are really two sets of build scripts. There's sample all, sample docbook, sample Eclipse help, etc. There's also a template docbook, template Eclipse help. So what's nice about this is that if you want to run it out of the box, you can open up, let's say, sample XHTML, for example, and it already has all the data pre-encoded in the file, or included in the file, let's say. For example, here we go, input is hierarchy.ditamap, that same test sample ditamap that we used a minute ago. However, if you want to go ahead and call your own files, you can use this template XHTML project build file. And instead of having the sample ditamap, it has these dummy values, data input, for example, that you can use, you can change to reflect the name of your document. So that's helpful also. It's much simpler, pretty straightforward. We're going to be looking at the build files in depth shortly, but just to give you a heads up. Okay, so now for example I can type in ant-f sample underscore xhtml.xml, and it failed because I didn't give it the full path. My mistake. So we want it to be in samples, ant sample, and then the name. So let's try that again. And f samples and sample xhtml.xml. Now it's going on its own with all the information already included in this file. Okay, so that was option 2 on this slide, which was to use the sample and build scripts in this directory using the same command window, or a new one opened via start command.batch, and writing in the name of the build file. Okay. Now, the two examples we just talked about are ways you can run it, as I said before, out of the box without needing to know too much about how it works. Now, obviously, we want to learn how it works so we can do it on our own as we like. So the first main thing to make note of is that in order to run the toolkit, there are always three main required parameters, three main pieces of information that we need to give the toolkit in order for it to work. And this is regardless of however you want to run it. Any method of running the toolkit requires these three pieces of information. The three pieces of information are args.input, which includes the path and name of the input file to publish, like your map, the trans type, which is the type of output to be produced, we're familiar with the list, and the output directory. In the sample we just ran, for example, these three are included. We have args.input, output directory, and trans type. Okay. Okay, now how can we run the toolkit? There are three primary methods of running the toolkit. One is using an ant build file, like the two we just demonstrated, build demo or ant sample, what have you. The second is the Java command line. And what that does for you is that it runs das.jar directly. So we talked about how das.jar is an important Java library that contains the main functions in the toolkit that are written in Java. So here, what we're doing is we're calling the library by using the Java call, meaning instead of ant now we're calling something through Java, -jar because we're calling a jar file. Here you can see we're calling das.jar. And in fact, we have the same three parameters we had before. Here we have /i, that's for the input parameter. /outdir is the output parameter, where it's going to go. And /trans type is which type of output you'd like to receive. So this code, in fact, would work, and some people and many CMSs use it now. It's an alternative way of calling the toolkit. What's a little difficult about calling it with Java is that it's harder to define custom parameters in Java. So if you want to make your own parameter, your own piece of information to tell the toolkit about how to publish something, it's much harder to do that using Java than it is using ant, which is one of the reasons that we at Suite Solutions normally use ant, but Java is used and works as well. A third method of running the toolkit is by using a property file. Same idea, just a slightly different method. You'd call it using an ant command, as we see on the bottom, right? Same ant -f. This time we're calling build.xml, which is the main file that runs the toolkit. And instead of providing a custom build file, as we saw in that first step in build demo, instead we're providing a property file. That's the -property file, which could be a text file. And that text file would have the same three main components we had in our earlier methods, namely args.input, trans type, and output directory. This third method I think is the least common way of doing it, but it's basically a variation on the ant method, but it does work and is a valid option if you'd like. Okay, so we're going to focus today on the sample ant build file, which we've already mentioned. Okay, here we have just something to point out. There's a property here that is called DITA.dir, and the value is the name of the DITA directory we're using. So for example, in my case, I installed DITA 151 and I called it DITA 151. I would change this to DITA 151 to make sure it's referencing the instance of the DITA OT that's on my machine. Now you can have multiple instances of the DITA OT on a given machine, which I do, and they'll all work. You just need to make sure that your build files are referencing the right one, or it'll be confusing. Okay, it's calling integrator to register any plugins. And then here's the main section that runs the toolkit. And in fact, I think I have it on the next slide in detail, a little bit bigger, so we're going to move to there. Okay, so here's that same target I just circled, and you'll see it's pretty straightforward. We've already had a preview of it a minute ago. Here for some reason it's not using DITA.dir, but instead of having the DITA directory written out, you could have a reference to a variable if you have it earlier in the file. I think I actually wrote in the text to make it less confusing. And you have your three parameters that we've already mentioned, args.input, the output directory, and the trans type. And this is how Ant calls the toolkit, passing in the required parameters we've discussed. We already ran a couple samples of it, so I'm not going to run a new one. Okay, so that's the basic overview of rendering output using different trans types. In summary, we have three main options. Option number 1 is using an Ant file. Option number 2 is calling das.jar directly from the command line using the Java command. And option number 3 is using running the build.xml file that runs the toolkit, also using Ant, but instead of making a custom project build file, we call a property file that has the same information in it in a separate file. And we mentioned that there are three main required parameters that need to be passed into the toolkit. Parameter number 1 is args.input. Parameter number 2 is the trans type. Parameter number 3 is output.dir is the output directory. Okay. So if there are no questions or comments here, we're going to move straight on to the next section, which is taking a closer look at customizing processing using Ant. Okay. So there are various ways of customizing processing using Ant. One of these methods is by just controlling how the output is being generated. Here I wrote calling multiple targets from a builds file. And the idea is that Ant builds files can be structured to run multiple targets simultaneously. So the example we just saw was running one DITA map with one trans type. But in real life, we all have many different needs from our DITA OT processing. We often want to run multiple outputs, either multiple documents with the same output type, the same trans type, or sometimes the same document with multiple output types. You might want to generate a PDF and an HTML file from the same DITA map, or any combination of those. Sometimes we have different languages, etc. So it's fairly easy to do this using Ant. Here I didn't write out all the code because I was just trying to demonstrate the idea, but I think it is valuable to look at a little more closely. So here I have the same introduction, but I have a new target. And I have a target which is called all. It's called by default, right? We have it up here. It says in the project, the default target is all. A target in Ant is kind of like a function. It's a unit of code that runs. And the dependency is two different targets, sample XHTML, sample to HTML help. So here, in a pretty straightforward way, I can run two documents at the same time. Here maybe I'd run the same input, the same DITA map, but with two different outputs. I could make my list, a list of 5 targets and run even more. But that's just a quick example of how to run multiple targets simultaneously. Now the next bullet is even one step beyond that, which is saying besides just running a list of targets, they can also be organized in a way that makes it easier for us to get the output we want with the least amount of effort. So one way of doing that is by nesting targets. So let me just show you an example from my samples here. So for example, I have here, let me see which one it is. Okay, so here's an example of a build sample with nested targets. So it's the same general methodology we saw before, right? We have the default being all, and then all having multiple dependencies, but here there's a second layer. So instead of having this target all only call the actual targets that run things, here it's calling, this is an example of where I want to run multiple languages. So here I'm saying call targets Spanish and English. And within Spanish and English, I can say, okay, now give me in English, give me product A and product B in English. And in Spanish, give me product A and product B in Spanish. And then here in the bottom here, we have the actual targets that include the input, trans type, and output directory, as we said. But basically what this does for me is it's very easy for me to change my mind. Let's say now I'm doing an English production cycle. So I could say, okay, you know what? Forget the Spanish, just call English. And with that, simple deletion of one word, now I only get my English dependency, my English DITA maps. Or I could say, no, I want them both, but I want to add something to the list. I can add on new targets down here. Or let's say in Spanish, I don't care about product B anymore, I only want product A. It's as simple as deleting the word, but the code is still sitting at the bottom, which enables me to put it back at any point. That's a useful trick to know, a useful way of structuring the project builds file that allows you to easily generate output when you want it and how you want it without making too many detailed technical changes. Okay. Now, another way of utilizing ANT output, in addition to structuring the build file, is by using it for debugging purposes. So what you saw when I ran the ANT output before, here's my command window, I got lots of different messages about what was happening. So it's interesting, first of all, to trace what steps the DITA is going through to give me output. And it's also interesting when you have an error, which occasionally happens to even the best of us, to see what the error is. Now, often one error will trigger many subsequent errors. So it's a useful trick is to look for the first error, because that's usually the real problem. Later errors might just be a cascading effect from the first one. So the first one is where you really want to try to figure out what went wrong. Another trick is that you can pipe output to a log file. Sometimes if you have a very large DITA map or multiple builds, or even just don't like looking at the little small screen, you want to have it in a text file instead. So by adding this over here, this greater than sign, with the name of the text file, it can be any text file, it will send all the output to the text file instead of showing it just on the screen. And this is especially useful for larger multiple DITA maps. And obviously this text file will be created in the directory that the command prompt is in. So if you're in DITA OT, you'll get log.txt in DITA OT. You can send it anywhere else by specifying exactly which directory it should be in. Okay, so that's another usage. Also for debugging, you can add information to the output. So instead of just taking what's there, you can echo contents of additional variables. So, the DITA OT already tells us, for example, which trans type we are, what's the name of the DITA map. It spits back the parameters in the beginning, as you can see here, base dir, DITA dir, trans type, etc. You can add your own here. Let's say you have a custom parameter or you want to check a different variable. You can echo it here or elsewhere in the processing if you're working from ANT. If you're working from XSL, you can use the XSL message element that will also send you information to the ANT output from the XSL for debugging purposes. So this last bit was a little bit more advanced. If you're not doing in-depth customization, it's probably not so relevant right now. But if you are, I just wanted to mention them as helpful hints for how to make the ANT processing work for you and help you with your debugging goals. Okay. Another thing you can do with ANT processing is that you can use trans-type specific parameters. So we already discussed at length how the input parameter, the output parameter, and the trans type are the ones that are required. But there's a whole slew of other ones that are important depending on what type of processing you're doing. So here I have a few examples, each for HTML help, the locale, and the version for Eclipse help, and the map root file name for Java help. But a fuller list is in the documentation that comes with the toolkit. Documentation can always be improved, but this does have a lot of useful information. So if you look in DITA OT doc, that's an interesting directory in general to browse if you're desperate or bored or like reading documentation. But specifically, I wanted to show you this DITA ANT script file because it has a nice chart that shows you the different parameters that are used for, there we go, for the DITA Open Toolkit. Okay, so for example, you have a general parameter table here where you see base dir, DITA dir, args input, etc., as we've discussed. And then when you scroll down later, you can see specific parameter tables for different outputs. So here, for example, we have HTML and XHTML. Different ones that have to do with the CSS file. Now here you might have DITA to Eclipse help. So this is a very useful file for documentation that I wanted to mention because you can see the full list of options you have for sending custom parameters to the toolkit. Okay, good. So that summarizes our section about customizing processing using ANT. To repeat in brief, we talked about structuring the build files in ways that help us control which output we're generating at once. We said that you can list multiple targets in a given build file to run several DITA maps, or the same DITA map with multiple output types, multiple trans types. We said you can nest the targets, so you can run, let's say, all of your English output or all of your Spanish one or any combination. We talked about looking at the output that comes from ANT to track the processing, to look at the first error, to use it for debugging by passing information into the ANT output. We talked about piping it into a file so we can see in a more user-friendly way what's there. We can do searches and the like. And we talked about sending custom parameters via ANT, both custom parameters and also trans-type specific parameters. It's as easy as adding a line into the project build file to pass more information into there. And we looked at a sample file of documentation in the doc directory that shows us a list of all the out-of-the-box options we have for sending parameters to the DITA OT. And in a second, when we look at DITAVAL, I'm going to show you a specific application of passing a specific parameter in the ANT build file. So we'll see an example of that as well. Are there any questions or comments at this point? Okay, if there are no questions or comments, we'll proceed. Now we're going to move on to filtering output using the DITAVAL file. Okay, so first of all, just a general introduction. Filtering or conditional processing is based on the four main conditional attributes: product, audience, platform, or other props. And the props attribute can be specialized to create additional conditional attributes. Now, how does this work? So first of all, by default, any information you have in your map will appear in the output, right? That's logical. That's why we put it in our map in the first place. So by default, all topics and elements are included. Now, what the DITAVAL file tells us is what to take out, which elements need to be excluded. This is done in a separate file called a DITAVAL file. So here's an example. There's a sample DITAVAL file. I'm going to show you also on my computer, garage.ditaval, using the test data from the toolkit. So we see here that it has, using the prop element, and it has several attributes. Attribute with the attribute name, with the conditional attribute name, and the value. So for example, this is saying anywhere where it says product equals Ford, include. Now you don't really need to write this because by default it's included. What's more interesting is the second line, which is saying, well, where it says product equals Honda, then you should exclude it. So that's step one. You need a DITAVAL file in order to be able to tell the toolkit what it is that you do and don't want to see in your output. Okay, so I have here this garage.ditaval file that we just looked at. And it has, in fact, here I wrote Honda exclude, and if the audience is admin, also exclude. That's one thing you need to do. Another thing you need to do is you need to tell the DITA OT about this DITA file. So the way you do that is exactly what we discussed in the previous section. Okay, you want to pass the name of the DITAVAL file as a parameter into the ANT build file. So I'll show you where I did that here. Here I have, for example, build sample with DITAVAL. Okay, and you see in addition to our required three parameters, trans type, input, and output, we have the temp directory, which isn't so interesting right now. But we also have this DITA input val file parameter, which comes with a toolkit and says, I'm sending you a DITAVAL file. Make sure you look there so you know what to include and exclude. Okay, and here it's referencing garage.ditaval. Okay, so that's the second thing you need. You need the DITAVAL file. You need to tell the toolkit about the DITAVAL file by passing it into the project build file. And lastly, and finally, obviously in your data, in your DITA map, you need to have the conditional attributes. So I did that also in our example. Here, for example, I took the hierarchy DITA map that we keep on talking about, and I stuck in some conditional attributes. Okay, I said, well, changing the oil is Ford and Honda and admin audience, and organizing is for Ford. You could see all the options here. So what this does for us is now if I run this file, for example, so I can say, let's go into there so I don't get too confused. So let's say I do cd samples build. Okay. Just to save on the typing mistakes here. Okay, so now I could do the regular and F that we've been doing, and F. I'll just paste the name. Okay, so it's running the toolkit using the DITAVAL file I provided. Okay, so now if we look at the out directory, okay, today's date, I could say, okay, look, I told it, well, let's see what we told it to do. We told it to exclude Honda and admin. So let's see what that meant. What that means is that shoveling snow is Honda and changing the oil is admin. So we don't want to see changing the oil or shoveling snow. We just want to see the overview, organizing, and spray painting. Let's see if that happened. Okay, overview, organizing, spray painting. It did not show us, in fact, changing the oil or spray painting. Okay, now just to talk about some details about how this worked, you'll see that changing the oil is Ford and Honda and admin. So what happens when the DITA OT gets different, says that part of this should be excluded and part of it should be included. So that's this next slide over here. It says if you want, let's say, a topic ref or an element, what have you, to disappear, it needs to, that means that all values for a particular attribute have to be excluded. If only one of the product values is excluded, the element will still appear. Right? So if we say, don't show me anything that has to do with Hondas, that's very nice. It won't show it to you if it's only a Honda. But if it also has to do with Ford, it'll show you because maybe you want it for Ford. If you don't want it at all, you have to say, don't show me anything for Honda or Ford if those are the two types of products that this piece of information has to do with. However, if all the values of any one of the attributes are excluded, the element will not appear. So here, for example, let's say that something has a product and an audience. I can exclude either the product or the audience and it won't show up. It sounds confusing, but the easiest way to do it and to demonstrate is just to show you or to try on your own. So here, for example, even though, let's say I take out the audience, okay, for changing the oil. Okay, and all I told it to do until now was to get rid of Hondas. There's no audience. So when I rerun it, the up arrow, by the way, types in the last ant command, and I refresh my screen here. So changing the oil has now suddenly appeared. Even though I told it to exclude, what was it, Honda, because changing the oil is both for Honda and for Ford, it showed up because maybe I'm printing a document for Ford now. However, if I put in now audience equals admin, and I tell it in my DITAVAL file, don't show me anything that has to do with an admin, and I rerun it. So now changing the oil will disappear because this is only for admin users, and I told it to exclude anything that has to do with an admin. So that's what I meant. Yeah, there it goes. That's what I meant by saying if it's within the same attribute. So if your data has to do with Ford and Honda, and I only exclude one of them, then it will appear, because maybe you want the other one. But if it's between attributes and I exclude all the products that has to do with this piece of data, or all of the audiences, in this case there's only one, then even if you didn't explicitly exclude, well, this is getting confusing, explicitly exclude all of the products, for example, it will still not appear because I told it to get rid of this audience. Like I said, it's much more complicated to explain than to see, but we just saw an example, and if you forget how it works, you can just test it with a simple example, and it will be pretty straightforward. I think part of what's confusing here is that we're writing down what we don't want to see. Instead of saying, show me anything that has to do with Ford, we're saying, well, don't show me things that have to do with Honda. So here's a little plug. Sweet Solutions developed a handy-dandy DITAVAL utility, which makes it a little more intuitive and a lot easier to control what it is you do and don't want to see. And I have to say I've been giving these webinars and seminars for a while, and I've already gotten several times some testimonials from people who say how this DITAVAL utility changed their life and made everything much easier. So I definitely recommend you to try it and download it. And like I said, the price is good because it's free. To show you a quick example here. I can start up the utility. And what it does for us is you can say, okay, go to my data map. So here it's hierarchy.datamap and analyze. Now it shows me there are little plus signs next to any attribute that has values in the data map. So obviously for the one we have, it's a little trivial because there aren't too many, but obviously if you're working with documents with many, many files in it, this is a huge feature just in and of itself to see where your conditional attributes are and what they are. And sometimes it also helps you see typos because it's very easy to misspell something and then it won't work and people don't understand why. Okay, so by clicking on the plus signs, you can see which topics have, first of all, you can see what conditional values are there. And by clicking on the conditional values, you can see in which file that value is located, which is very, very nice. And then the other thing you can do is you can pick the things you want to include instead of excluding. So you could say, okay, I'm giving a document about Ford and Honda, and it's for administrators. And then instead of saying, I don't want Volkswagen, which is less intuitive, then you can write create DITAVAL file, and you could do demo1, let's say, .ditaval. If I save it, it says file successfully created. I can then go back to my directory and here I have demo1.ditaval. When I open it up, so it says give me Ford, Honda, and admin and exclude Volkswagen. So it makes life a little easier and more straightforward than having to think about it. First of all, know what everything is off the top of your head, and also having to only write what you don't want instead of clicking what you do want. So that's the plug for our free DITAVAL utility. Feel free to download it. Hopefully it will make your life easier. Okay. Then besides just telling you about the DITAVAL utility, I also just wanted to mention that besides using conditional attributes to include and exclude a value, you can also set the action of a DITAVAL entry to flag. What that does is it will distinguish that element in the output. The flagging style can be determined by the attributes of the prop element in the DITAVAL file. For example, color sets the text color, back color sets the background color, and style sets the text style. And here's an example of code that I have in mind. And you'll see I stuck it in one of them. Let's see which one. If I can remember. I don't know if I remember. Or we can also just look at it. No, that's not it. Here, one sec. If I go to tasks, for example, so I changed taking out the garbage. Okay. So here we have taking out the garbage. Let's go to our output. Okay, so you could see we have pink, italics, and red. And that came from the fact that inside taking out the garbage, I wrote products equals Volkswagen. And then the DITAVAL file, I wrote when the product is Volkswagen, flag it, and give me color red, back color pink, styles, italics. So there'll be a webinar later in the summer that's going to go into detail about flagging using DITAVAL files for HTML and PDF and all sorts of other fun things like change tracking. But I just wanted to mention, if we're already on the topic of DITAVAL, that it does allow you to do flagging, and it's relatively easy to set exactly how you want the changed text to appear. And for more details, you can look in the DITA language spec in the prop attribute, the prop element. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of filtering output using DITAVAL. We talked about how there are 3 components needed to filter output using DITAVAL. One is an actual DITAVAL file which states which elements to exclude, which conditional values to exclude. The second is a parameter in your project build file that tells the DITA-OT about this DITAVAL file and where it is. And the third thing is obviously in your content, in your DITA or DITA map or both, you need to have a conditional attribute set in order to indicate which text applies to which product and which audience, etc. And I showed you how we have a little free utility that lets you manage your DITAVALs in a convenient way, in a more intuitive way. And that's easy to download. And I also mentioned that in addition to filtering based on DITAVAL values and conditional attributes, you can also flag pieces of text to distinguish them from others using a DITAVAL file. So that concludes the main topics we wanted to cover today. Now I just wanted to take a minute to talk about DITA-OT resources, different places you can go to find out more information about the DITA-OT. So for example, there does exist a Toolkit user guide. It's, it could be more comprehensive, but it does cover many aspects of the toolkit, and it's a good place to start to learn about the toolkit. Here's the link. There's also documentation within the toolkit. So I mentioned one file, which was ant scripts. But here there are a number of them. You can go to the index to see what's there. So again, that's in doc, DITA-OT doc. We talked about dita-antscript.html, but there's a whole bunch of files here, which can be useful. There's always SourceForge. In addition to downloading the DITA-OT, there are a number of plugins you can download, other pieces of information about the DITA-OT. There's a tracker with issues, requests for enhancements, etc. There's DITA users email list, which I assume most of us are already familiar with, but it's a good place to ask questions, get answers. You can search the archives. There's another website about DITA called DITA Info Center. So these are all good places to go to get more information about the DITA-OT. This is just a sample. I'm sure there are many other resources out there also that I did not include here. So that concludes our discussion for today. We talked in general about what the DITA-OT is and what it does for us. We talked about the different components of the DITA-OT architecture, and we went into a little bit of detail about some of them, like dos.jar, the XSLT parser, etc. We talked about, in general, how to render outputs using different trans types. We started off with the files that were included in the toolkit, then went on to 3 different methods, Java and property files, and then we went a little more deeply into customizing processing using Ant, different debugging methods, different project build files, custom parameters, or out-of-the-box parameters, etc. And finally, we concluded with discussing how to filter output using DITAVAL files, what components are needed to make the puzzle work together, flagging using DITAVAL, and the DITAVAL utility from Suite Solutions. And we finished up our session by looking very briefly at different online resources that you can use, also resources that come with the DITA-OT, to learn more about the toolkit and to help you with research or problem solving when the need arises. So thank you all for participating, and looking forward to seeing many of you next time. Have a good night.